Concrete slammed against my spine, and the smell of rain and dead gasoline flooded my nose. Min Do-hyuk's hand was wrapped around my throat, and in the dark of the Hanwool garage, no camera reached this blind spot. 300 million, he whispered, tilting his phone toward my face so I could read the message I was never supposed to see. My blood price. And tonight, you're the collateral. But across the wet asphalt, in a matte black G90 with its engine off, a gold lighter clicked once in the dark, and the man who owned every brick of this building had been watching me for 6 months. I want to tell you how I got here, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where I started. My name is Amara Cole. I'm 29 years old, and 3 years ago I left Chicago with 2 suitcases and a job offer that seemed too good to check twice. Senior Forensic Analyst, Hanwool Financial Group, Gangnam. I told myself it was ambition. Really, it was escape. I wanted a city where nobody knew my history, where I could be a spreadsheet and nothing else. I got half of what I wanted. I became a spreadsheet. I never stopped being an outsider. I was the only black woman on my floor, then the only one in the building. Then, as far as I could tell, one of maybe a handful in the entire tower. Seoul does not hide how it feels about that. Not with slurs, usually, with silence. With the way conversations paused a half-second too long when I walked into a room, the way clients addressed the man next to me, even when I was the one holding the file, the way beauty was defined so narrowly around me that I learned to make myself smaller just to stop absorbing the stares. I got good at it. I got good at apologizing for the space I took up in elevators, in meetings, in a country that had already decided, before I opened my mouth, what I was allowed to be. I want to be specific about what that looked like. Because I think people who haven't lived it imagine something dramatic, some single cruel sentence you can point to and say, there, that's the wound. It wasn't like that. It was smaller, and it was everywhere. It was the way a client's eyes would slide past me to find the nearest man in the room, any man, even a junior analyst half my seniority, because his face made more sense to them as the source of the numbers. It was the beauty counters downstairs in the lobby mall that carried 40 shades of foundation and exactly none of them for me. It was coworkers complimenting my English like it was a party trick instead of my first language, and then looking faintly disappointed when I answered a question too quickly, too competently, like I'd broken some unspoken rule about which box I was supposed to stay inside. I built my whole personality around not being a problem. I laughed a half-beat softer than I wanted to. I dressed a shade more conservative than my actual taste. I let people mispronounce my name for months before correcting them, because correcting them meant drawing attention to the fact that I existed at all. And existing loudly had never once, in my experience, worked out in my favor. By the time Do-hyuk found me in that garage, I had spent 3 years turning myself into wallpaper with excellent Excel skills. I told myself it was professionalism. It was actually a slow, patient kind of disappearing, and I didn't even notice I was vanishing until a man with a broken lighter and a debt he couldn't pay decided to remind me, with his hand around my throat, exactly how small he still thought I was. So when Min Do-hyuk found me in that garage at 11:47 at night, some old, exhausted part of me had already braced for it. He was my ex. 2 years together back when I first arrived. 2 years I spent convincing myself that a Korean man loving me loudly in private and never in public was still love. He used to call me his secret. I used to let that word feel romantic instead of what it actually was, which was a cage with better lighting. I met him at a rooftop bar my second month in the city, back when I still believed every kind word from a stranger was proof I'd made the right choice moving here. He was charming in the specific way men are charming when they've never once had to work for anything, quick with compliments, quicker with excuses about why we could never be seen together at his family's events, why his mother could never know, why it was easier, safer, better for both of us, if I simply stayed in the part of his life with the lights off. I told myself it was cultural, complicated, not personal. It took me a year longer than it should have to understand that hiding someone and loving someone are not two versions of the same thing, they are opposites wearing the same coat. When I finally left him, he didn't fight for me. He just found someone he didn't have to hide, and I told myself that was the end of it. I did not know, standing in that garage 2 years later, that his gambling debts to a syndicate called Hanwool had been quietly compounding that entire time. or that the ledger of my old heartbreak was about to become collateral in a war I hadn't even known was being fought. That night he had my back against a concrete pillar and his forearm across my collarbone, and he said the ugliest thing a person has ever said to my face. "You think a fat black girl gets to walk away from me? I want you to sit with that sentence the way I had to sit with it. Pinned, unable to breathe right, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing like it was embarrassed for both of us. My coat sleeve tore. His cologne had gone sour with sweat and panic, and underneath the cruelty I could smell something else on him. Fear. His phone buzzed against my collarbone where he was holding it, and for 1 second he forgot me entirely. A message in Korean, a name I recognized from financial filings I wasn't supposed to have memorized. Ilwal, 300 million won. Tomorrow. His face changed for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw a man who owed people much worse than me a debt he could not pay. And something in my chest, some cold, careful part of me that had spent 3 years reading columns of numbers until they told the truth even when people didn't, clicked into place. I did not flinch. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not make myself smaller. I quoted procurement code at him, cold and exact. The kind of thing that meant nothing to him and everything to me, because it was the sound of my own voice refusing to shake. He slammed his palm against the pillar beside my head hard enough that the sound cracked through the garage like a gunshot. That was when I heard it. A gold lighter, clicking open and shut once, somewhere in the dark. No footsteps before it, no engine idling, just that single metallic click, and Do-hyuk's raised hand stopped in the air like the whole garage had frozen around it. Someone was here. Someone had been here the entire time. I did not know his name yet. I only knew that whoever it was had let this go on long enough to be sure of something before he moved, and that the not knowing terrified me more than Do-hyuk's hand ever had. Do-hyuk's arm was still against my throat when he finally answered whatever fear had gripped him, and he stopped pretending this was about the past between us. He told me the truth, or the shape of it he understood. 300 million won, owed to a syndicate called Ilwol by dawn, and he wasn't trying to win me back at all. He was trying to sell what I had, my security clearance, my badge access to Hanwool's shipping manifests out of Incheon. He wasn't here for love. I was collateral he thought he still owned, a debt he intended to pay with my hands. I did the only thing I know how to do under pressure, which is stall and calculate at the same time. I said something about how he used to love me, watched it land somewhere soft in him, bought myself 2-3 more seconds while my mind ran through exits I didn't have, and then the world went white. The G90's headlights detonated across the garage, twin blinding columns of LED light that turned the falling drizzle into a curtain of silver glass. I threw my arm up. Through the glare I watched a shape unfold itself from the driver's seat, tall, unhurried, a silhouette in a charcoal 3-piece suit that seemed to absorb the light instead of reflect it. By the time my eyes adjusted, he was already across the garage, and Do-hyuk's arm, the one that had been across my throat 30 seconds earlier, was bent at an angle arms are not built to bend. I heard it before I understood it, a sound like a dry branch breaking in deep winter. Do-hyuk went down screaming, and the stranger wiped his knuckles clean with a black silk handkerchief he produced from an inside pocket, like he'd rehearsed the motion 1,000 times. "I own this building," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, terrifyingly calm. "Every brick, every camera, every inch of this concrete." That was the first time I heard Kang Woo-jin speak. I did not know yet that he was the chairman of Hanwool Financial Group on paper and the head of the Baekryong syndicate underneath it, that the tower I'd worked in for 3 years was 2 buildings wearing the same glass skin. I only knew that the man who had just broken my ex-boyfriend's arm in under 10 seconds was now draping his own suit jacket over my shaking shoulders, and that his hands, when they touched my collar to settle the fabric, were unbearably gentle. "No cameras reach this blind spot," he murmured, close enough that I felt the words more than heard them. "But I see everything. I had my management team move your parking pass to level P3 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. He had rerouted my entire parking assignment 2 weeks before I ever needed rescuing, on the off chance that someday I would. I didn't have time to unpack what that meant before his phone lit up in his hand, one word glowing on the screen. Incheon. His face went utterly blank, some door sliding shut behind his eyes, and for a moment the man standing in front of me was somewhere else entirely, dealing with a version of his life I hadn't been shown yet. He took me to a penthouse on the 58th floor of a building in Hanam-dong that night, and I want to be honest, I didn't fight it. I was in shock, and shock makes strange bargains with safety. The apartment was glass and steel, and the kind of quiet that costs more than my annual salary. Seoul's skyline bleeding red and gold through floor-to-ceiling windows, while rain streaked the glass like the city itself was crying for me. I sat on a couch I was afraid to leave a mark on, and watched Kang Woo-jin become two different men within the same hour. The first time, he was on a call, pacing near the window, and his voice dropped into something flat and final, while he discussed a dock foreman who had apparently been skimming from shipment manifests. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He said maybe 11 words total, and something in the tone told me a man's entire life had just been revised like a clerical error. When he hung up, his face didn't change at all. I sat frozen on that couch, still in his jacket, watching him and thinking, this is the real him, this stillness, this efficiency with other people's lives, and some small rational part of my brain started quietly cataloging exits again, the way it had in the garage, the way it had every single time a man's temper had ever made the air in a room feel thinner. Then he turned and saw me flinch, and something in him recalibrated instantly. He crossed the room, adjusted the thermostat without a word, and returned 5 minutes later with tea made exactly the way I take it at the office. Splash of milk, no sugar, steeped 4 minutes instead of 3. I had never once told him how I take my tea. He had been watching that long. I remember sitting on that couch for a long time without moving, his jacket still around my shoulders, smelling faintly of cold metal and something like sandalwood, and thinking, this is insane, I should call someone, I should leave, and underneath that thought, quieter and more honest, the realization that there was no one to call. My parents were in Ocean and 14 hours away. My friends here were work friends, the kind who ask how you're doing in the elevator and mean it exactly as long as the doors stay open. I had built a life in Seoul so carefully unremarkable that when the worst night of it arrived, there was no net under me at all, except a stranger with blood on his knuckles and a building full of secrets. He noticed me shivering, though the penthouse wasn't cold. And without a word he crossed to a cabinet and came back with a throw blanket that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent, draping it over my knees with a care that didn't match anything I'd seen him do to Do-hyuk 20 minutes earlier. I studied his hands while he did it, long fingers, a faint white scar tracing the edge of one knuckle, nails clean and unremarkable, nothing about them that should have been capable of the sound I'd heard in the garage. That was the first time I understood, really understood, that violence and gentleness could live in the same set of hands without either one canceling the other out. It should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it made me watch him even more closely, the analyst in me cataloging inconsistencies the way I catalog anomalies in a ledger, filing him under things that don't add up yet. Why P3? I asked him, testing the silence. He didn't answer. He watched the rain instead, jaw tight, and I understood I had touched something he wasn't ready to hand me yet. His phone rang again. Incheon, again, and I watched something flicker behind his eyes, quick and gone. I filed it away the way I file every anomaly. Why does the chairman of a financial group flinch at the word for a port? The next morning he gave me a cleared workspace on the top floor of the tower, past a security checkpoint I'd never even known existed in 3 years of employment. A corner office with a view of the Han River going silver under low cloud. A woman I didn't recognize brought coffee without being asked and left without meeting my eyes, and I understood immediately that whatever floor this was, it did not officially exist on any org chart I'd ever seen. He gave me the workspace, ostensibly to review something he called the Incheon books. I want to tell you, I have read a lot of financial architecture in my career. I have never seen anything as elegant or as terrifying as what I found in those files. I want to walk you through what that actually looked like, because the craft of it frightened me more than any threat could have. A normal fraud has a smell to it. Round numbers where round numbers shouldn't exist. Timestamps clustering around holidays. Vendors whose addresses resolve to empty parking lots. This was not that. This was a system built by someone who understood exactly how a forensic mind works, constructed specifically to survive the kind of scrutiny I was trained to apply. Shell companies staggered 18 months apart, so no single audit window would ever catch more than one at a time. Transfers routed through legitimate shipping insurance claims. Dollar amounts matched almost perfectly to real cargo losses, so the noise buried the signal. Shell companies nested inside shell companies, transfers that existed for exactly the length of time required to erase their own origin. A laundering structure disguised so well as ordinary corporate finance that it nearly made me forget to breathe when I finally saw the shape of it whole. This was not a company. This was a syndicate, wearing a company's clothes, and I was sitting inside its ribs, 3 hours in, admiring a lock I couldn't pick, and hating myself a little for the admiration. He found me staring at the pattern hours later, my coffee gone cold beside me, rain crawling down the glass behind him. I braced for punishment. Instead, he sat across from me and told me about a debtor, a dock worker who had drowned trying to make a payment he couldn't afford, and how he had signed that man's remaining debt into nothing. "The debt dies with the dead," he said, and his scarred hand trembled, just once, over a photograph on the desk he didn't know I'd seen. I stopped, in that moment, examining the numbers. I started examining him, and that night I noticed the ledger he'd given me was missing a page. Page 47, cut clean, no ragged edge, a surgical removal, not an accident. I didn't tell him. It was the first secret I kept inside his house, and I lay awake wondering why the man who owned every page in that building would need to hide exactly one of them from the woman he'd asked to read it. 2 nights later he took me to the docks at Incheon, past midnight, crane lights strobing white against low clouds, diesel thick in my throat, rain splitting neon reflections across wet asphalt into long red and gold ribbons. I hadn't asked why he wanted me there. Part of me already understood that with a man like Woo-jin, invitations were rarely just invitations, they were introductions, and I was being introduced to something. I wore flats instead of heels that night on instinct, some old survival calculation running quietly under the surface, the kind of decision you make in your body before your mind catches up to why. A mid-level dealer, drunk on rank and soju, made the mistake of calling me the boss's black pet loud enough for the whole loading yard to hear. I felt the old familiar heat rise in my face, the specific humiliation of being reduced to 2 words by a stranger who had never once had to think about how the world saw him first. 3 years of swallowing exactly this kind of sentence rose up in my throat all at once, and for half a second I braced to do what I always did, shrink, look away, let it pass unanswered because answering it had never once been safe. The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific quiet of a held breath. Woo-jin didn't shout. He made the man kneel on the wet concrete and apologize to me by name, and I watched the whisper move through the yard like current through water. "She's his. I want to tell you I hated it. Some of me did, but some other part of me, the part that had spent 3 years shrinking in elevators, felt something shift under my ribs that had nothing to do with shame at all. For the first time since I'd landed in this country, being someone's did not feel like disappearing. It felt like being seen. That was when I saw it, on a desk near the loading office, half buried under a stack of manifests, Doohyuk's loan papers, the 300 million won contract with Ilwol, and beneath the folded corner, a signature. I only caught half of it before someone shifted the stack, but something about the shape of those characters snagged in my memory like a hook in fabric. I knew that signature. I had seen it somewhere in Hanwool's own internal paperwork. Someone inside Baekryong had leaked my schedule to my ex. The mole wasn't outside the walls. It was already living inside the house that was supposed to be protecting me. By that point I had started to let myself relax, just slightly, into the strange new rhythm of my life. Mornings in the cleared office with the river turning silver. Evenings in the penthouse where he'd started leaving small things for me without comment. A book he thought I'd like. A specific brand of tea he'd apparently had flown in. I want to be honest and tell you I noticed the danger of getting comfortable and let myself do it anyway, because for the first time in 3 years, comfort was on offer at all, and I was tired of refusing things just because I was scared of what accepting them might cost me later. 6 days after the garage, a routine manifest transfer at the container yard became a killing ground instead. It started with a barge that pulled in wrong, engines cutting out at an angle no honest captain would choose, and I knew before anyone shouted that this was staged. Then there was a blade coming out of the rain, aimed low and fast, exactly at the height of my throat, and I understood with total clarity that I was about to die in a foreign country over a debt I never signed. Woo-jin moved faster than I could track. He didn't push me aside, he put his body between the blade and mine, and I felt the knife find his forearm instead of my neck. Felt the wet heat of his blood hit my palms before I'd even processed what had happened. Rust-colored containers stacked into a canyon around us, rain hammering the steel like applause for something obscene, and somewhere at the edge of my vision Baekryong men closed in on an attacker whose eyes had already gone dead and empty, following orders from someone who wasn't there. I held pressure on his arm with both hands. my voice the only steady thing in that whole rain-drowned yard. "Don't you dare die in front of me." I meant it as a command. It came out as something closer to a prayer. Later, in the sterile quiet of the penthouse, I refused to leave while the doctor stitched him. Iodine soaked into white silk, I sat on the edge of that enormous bed watching a private physician work a needle through a man who had, hours earlier, walked into a blade meant for me without a second of hesitation, and I found myself furious at him in a way I couldn't fully explain. Furious that he'd made that trade so easily, like his own life was simply worth less than mine in whatever ledger he kept in his head. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just held his uninjured hand too tightly and let the anger sit quietly under the fear. Steam curled off tea I made wrong on purpose, an excuse to stay near him, and he drank it anyway without a single complaint. Somewhere past midnight, deep in fever, he said the one sentence I don't think he meant for me to hear. "I am not afraid of the dark. I am afraid of losing you in it." I sat very still after that, replaying it, because a man who erased other men's lives with 11 flat words on a phone call had just handed me, unguarded and half-conscious, the single most frightened sentence I'd ever heard him say. I didn't know yet what to do with it. I only knew I wanted to keep it somewhere safe. His hand found my wrist on its own, unconscious, and he said my name, Amara. Not Miss Cole, not the boss's woman, not any of the labels this city kept trying to fold me into. Just my name, spoken like it belonged to him the way scripture belongs to the person who prays it every night. But it was that same night, watching his phone light up with a name I now recognized, Hanwool, his most trusted lieutenant, his right hand in every sense of the phrase, that I noticed the pattern with the same cold clarity I use on a ledger full of lies. Every single time that name lit up his screen, something bad followed me within hours. I didn't say anything. I tucked it away the way I tuck away every anomaly that isn't ready to be spoken yet, and I let him sleep. I remember getting ready for that gala with a strange, hollow calm, sitting in front of a mirror in a dress a stylist had brought up specifically for me, cut and fitted by someone who clearly did not usually design for a body like mine, and yet somehow, impossibly, it fit like it had been drawn around me on purpose. I stared at my reflection for a long time. I thought about every room in this city that had made me feel like an afterthought, every beauty counter without my shade, every meeting where my voice had to fight twice as hard to be heard at half the volume of everyone else's. And I thought, tonight, I am not going to apologize for a single inch of this dress. The gala came a week later, and it was the first time I stood beside him in public as something other than a rumor. Chandeliers dripping gold light, champagne flutes catching camera flashes, and the particular hum of Seoul's elite whispering about the black woman on the chairman's arm, loud enough that I was meant to hear it, quiet enough that they could pretend deniability. Woo-jin introduced me not as decoration but as the woman who reads my books, and I understood, even wrapped in silk I never could have afforded on my own salary, that the sentence was a coronation disguised as small talk. A hand found the small of my back from behind, too low, too familiar, belonging to a man I'd never met and would never need to meet again. My whole body did the thing it had trained itself to do for 3 years, went still, went small, prepared to simply absorb it and move on like a professional, because making a scene had never once, in my experience, worked out better than swallowing the discomfort quietly. Before I could finish that old, exhausted calculation, Woo-jin was already there. He removed the man from the room and from the city's memory, in 2 sentences and total, terrible calm. "If you touch what is mine, I will end your name." I felt the danger radiating off him like heat off asphalt, and for the first time, I didn't flinch away from it. I let it settle into me like armor. There was something almost dizzying about watching a room full of powerful men go quiet on my behalf, after 3 years of watching rooms go quiet in spite of me. And while the room reoriented itself around the scene, I made my own move, quiet, unnoticed, sliding the missing page 47, the one I'd secretly copied weeks earlier, into the lining of my coat. The rescue had become a partnership. I just hadn't told him yet. As they dragged the groper out of the ballroom, he gasped one phrase under his breath that turned the champagne in my stomach to ice. "Ilwal sends regards." They had been inside the gala the entire night, moving among us in tailored suits, invisible because nobody expects the enemy to wear the same silk as the host, and that was when I noticed the wrongness in my own glass, a faint bitterness under the sweetness that had nothing to do with the vintage. I had been drugged. Someone had planned to take me tonight, and I had been sipping the proof the entire time without knowing it. I want to tell you how ordinary that hallway looked right up until it wasn't. Marble floor, gold sconces, the muffled sound of the ballroom fading behind a set of double doors, and I remember thinking, absurdly, about whether I'd left my clutch on the table. That's the thing nobody warns you about danger. It doesn't announce itself with music, it just quietly rearranges the furniture of an ordinary moment until the moment isn't ordinary anymore. They took me between one hallway and the next. My escort simply wasn't there anymore. The corridor lights died in sequence like dominoes, and the last thing I remember before the world went black was the sweet, wrong taste still on my tongue. I woke bound in a container yard, rope burning my wrists, diesel and salt thick in the air, gulls screaming somewhere above the rain-slicked steel. My head throbbed with whatever they'd used to keep me under, and for a long, disoriented moment I genuinely couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there, only that my shoulders ached from being pulled behind my back for however many hours had passed, and that the cold coming off the metal beneath me had soaked all the way through my dress. Illwall's kingpin came to gloat, and what he told me broke something open in my chest that I had not been braced for. Do-hyuk's 300 million won debt was never real. It had been fabricated from the start, a staged weapon built specifically to use my own ex-boyfriend against me, because the real collateral in this entire war was never money, it was me. I was the only person alive who could read Baekryong's ghost ledgers, the hidden port accounts laundered clean through Hanwool's books. Your chairman knew what you were worth the whole time, he said, savoring it. That's why he watched you. You're just another asset. I want to tell you that sentence didn't land. It landed like the floor disappearing. 6 months of a man rerouting my parking pass, memorizing my tea order, breaking bones for my honor, and I couldn't tell anymore if any of it had been devotion or inventory management with better lighting. Was I seen, or was I counted? I sat there in the dark, wrists raw, and did something I hadn't let myself do since the plane out of Chicago 3 years earlier. I grieved, not for my life, though I genuinely did not know yet if I would keep it. I grieved for the version of myself that had let herself believe, for one soft, foolish handful of weeks, that a man like that could want a woman like me without an angle underneath it. I thought about the tea, the parking pass, the way he'd said my name in fever sleep like it was the only word he had left. I thought about how easy it would be, how convenient for everyone in that yard, if I simply believed I had been nothing but an asset all along, and let that belief break me quietly in the rain. And then, underneath the grief, something harder surfaced, something that had been building in me since the day I first sat down in that top-floor office and refused to look away from numbers designed to make me look away. Even if I had been an asset to him, I was not going to be one to them. Whatever I was to Kang Woo-jin, I was still, and had always been, my own. But here's the thing about being trained your whole life to survive rooms that don't want you in them. My flinch didn't come. Something colder and more useful arrived instead. I stopped being the victim in that container and became the only forensic mind in the room. And Illwall's kingpin, in his arrogance, had just handed me their entire position without realizing it. I hid the ghost ledger pages deeper in my coat lining, and as the guard leader turned his shoulder, I caught the glint of his cufflink, a crest I recognized instantly because I'd seen it on Woo-jin's own right hand 100 times. Hanwoo's crest. The mole finally had a face, and it meant the betrayal had been living inside the castle the entire time. While I sat chained in that container doing math nobody in the room knew I was capable of, Woo-jin's world came apart somewhere else in the city. I only learned the details later, pieced together from the men who were there and could not stop talking about it afterward. The way soldiers talk about the one battle that changes how they see their commander forever. He learned Hanwoo's name, and something in him that had spent decades being unbreakable simply detonated. He burned a port contract worth 200 billion won, an entire faction's worth of face and leverage, gone in a single signature, because it bought him a location on me faster than anything else could. Soldiers moved on Illwall's positions under strobing muzzle flashes and driving rain, and the men who were there told me that the only time in living memory anyone had heard Kang Woo-jin scream was the moment the ransom photo of me hit his phone. A raw, inhuman sound, they said, the kind a room doesn't forget. They dragged Hanwoo in front of him, and he said the truth out loud for the first time, in front of soldiers who would carry that story for the rest of their lives. Why he'd moved my parking pass. Why Incheon had made his face go blank every single time. Why I had never been a random obsession. Why keeping me safe had never only been about my heart. You think I protected the ledgers, he said. I protected the woman who could destroy them. And then, in front of everyone, he crushed the gold lighter he never went anywhere without under his heel, grinding 6 months of careful, controlled surveillance into scrap metal on the concrete. The radio crackled through his men's hands, Ilwar's kingpin's voice thin and cruel over the static. The girl for the ledgers, or we send her home in pieces. Woo-jin answered yes without a single second of hesitation. But across that yard, in a container he thought was still simply holding me, I was already moving. I want you to understand something about me that took 29 years and 1 kidnapping to fully believe. I am not just an asset. I am not just collateral, or an inventory line, or a woman waiting for a man to come save her from a debt she never signed. I am a forensic analyst who has spent 3 years reading lies for a living. And Ilwar had made the single worst mistake of the entire war. They had locked me in a room with a pen. I want you to understand what it actually felt like, sitting cross-legged on a cold container floor with rope burns on my wrists, deciding I was done waiting to be rescued. Every skill I had ever built, every late night in a Chicago office proving myself twice over to men who assumed I'd gotten the job some other way. Every quiet humiliation I had swallowed in 3 years of Seoul boardrooms funneled itself into that one scrap of paper. I wasn't thinking about Woo-jin storming toward me through the rain. I wasn't thinking about rescue at all. I was thinking the way I think about a ledger that's lying to me, which is to say, with total, focused, almost peaceful clarity. I forged a manifest on whatever scraps I could find, a spreadsheet trap that quietly implicated Hyunwoo in Ilwal's own off-book accounts, turning his betrayal into a landmine buried inside the very books he thought protected him. I built a signal into it too, a doc stacker code that any Baekryong analyst worth their salt would read instantly as a location flare. When the kingpin came back to check on his collateral, gloating, I looked him dead in the eye and recited his own laundering architecture back to him from memory, his shell accounts, his ghost routes, the exact arithmetic he thought only he understood. I watched his face go the color of wet concrete. For one long, impossible moment, I was not the frightened woman chained to a pipe. I was the devil's own accountant, reading his sins back to him by heart, my heels clicking against the container floor as I stood and refastened them like I had somewhere important to be. The door swung open not long after, and it was not Baekryong storming in to save me. It was Do-hyuk, knife shaking in his hand, eyes cracked open with a fear I recognized because I used to wear it myself. They doubled my debt, he said, voice breaking. Now I have to kill you myself. I'm sorry, Amara. I'm so sorry. The blade trembled in the space between us, and I don't know, even now, which way it would have fallen, because that was the exact moment the yard outside erupted into raid and rain and gunfire, and the world I'd been trying to survive finally came to find me. I've thought a lot, since then, about what it means that Do-hyuk's ending and my beginning happened in the same rain, on the same night, in the same stretch of docks. He had spent 2 years teaching me that love could be conditional, hidden, ashamed of itself in daylight. I don't feel triumphant about how his story ended. I feel, mostly, a tired kind of grief for the boy he might have been if debt and shame hadn't hollowed him out long before I ever met him. But I also know that grief doesn't obligate me to forgive what his hand did to my throat in that garage, and I stopped, somewhere around that night, needing the 2 feelings to cancel each other out. Baekryong stormed the docks in force that night, and I remember it now in fragments, the way you remember the worst and best nights of your life. Gulls screaming overhead, strobing muzzle flashes turning the rain into flickering silver needles, blood washing pink into the gutters. Do-hyuk's fate mirrored the very night he'd cornered me in that garage months earlier, found later on a midnight bus out of the city with both hands broken, a message stitched into the injury that everyone in that world understood without translation. The debt is paid. Hyunwoo was dragged in front of the assembled clan and stripped of every title he'd ever worn, his crest cufflink confiscated as evidence, his name unmade in front of the men who used to salute him. And in the center of all that carnage, Woo-jin reached me, and the first thing he did was not violence. It wasn't even relief exactly. He pulled me into his coat like he was trying to fold the entire war outside it, and the hand he'd bled for weeks earlier shook, actually shook, as it touched my face to make sure I was real. I was the one who handed him the forged manifest, the landmine I'd built in that container with nothing but a pen and my own memory, the thing that would finish breaking Ilwal's books from the inside out. And he looked at me the way you look at something you had catastrophically underestimated, like he was seeing a queen for the first time, instead of an asset he'd been quietly protecting. Ilwal's kingpin slipped away on a barge into the dark before Baekryong could close the net completely, and I understood, even wrapped in Woo-jin's coat with my pulse still hammering, that the war was not actually over. But the ledger I'd rewritten with my own hands was burning, page by page, in my coat pocket, and I let it burn on purpose. Some things you keep. Some things you finally get to choose to release. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid anymore, but because I kept turning the last few months over in my hands like a coin I was trying to decide the value of. I thought about the woman who had landed in Incheon Airport 3 years earlier with 2 suitcases and a habit of apologizing for existing. I thought about the garage, the penthouse, the ledger room, the docks, the container, the knife in Do-hyuk's shaking hand. Every one of those rooms had tried, in its own particular way, to tell me what I was worth, and every single time I had been the one who ended up doing the actual math. That felt important to hold on to, walking into whatever came next. The next morning they gathered the elders of Baekryong and the board of Hanwool in the same steel and glass boardroom where I'd once been tolerated as a curiosity, the odd hire, the token of some diversity quota nobody would say out loud. Morning light broke through rain-streaked windows onto polished marble, coffee steam curling up beside stacks of ledgers, with my handwriting all over the corrected pages. I recognized several of the older men in that room. They were the ones who used to look past me toward whichever man stood nearest, the ones whose eyes had slid off me in hallways, like I was a smudge on the glass they hadn't gotten around to cleaning. I made sure, walking in, that not one of them could look past me today. Woo-jin stood in front of the men who had built empires on debts and blood and silence, and he said the coldest, most absolute sentence of his entire life. "This woman owns my ledgers, my ports, and my blood. Disrespect her, and you answer to her." I stood there in a tailored charcoal suit of my own choosing, coat finally off, nothing left on my shoulders that wasn't mine, and I looked at every man in that room who had once looked through me like I was furniture, and I spoke my own vow instead of simply receiving his. And he answers to me. The room bowed. I want you to understand what that meant, in that specific room, to those specific men. It was not romance, it was not rescue, it was recognition, the kind I had crossed an ocean and buried 3 years of my own shrinking self to finally earn on my own terms. His gold lighter, the one he'd crushed in the rain the night everything broke open, had been replaced, and he lit it that morning not as a threat to anyone, but simply to light the ink drying under my signature on the new ledgers. His hand lay open on the table between us, palm up, not a command, an offering. I signed. I own those books now, the real ones and the ghost ones both, and there is a particular kind of quiet that comes with finally being the one who decides what gets written down and what gets erased. I do not flinch in elevators anymore. I do not apologize for the space I take up in a room. I learned, the hard way, in a garage, in a penthouse, in a rain-drowned shipping container, that the only person who gets to decide my worth is the woman doing the arithmetic. Me. There is one thing I never told him, and I don't know yet if I ever will. Buried inside the rewritten ledger, folded into a page even he doesn't know I kept, is a name. Page 47. The person who really set this entire war into motion, the one who whispered the idea of a fabricated debt into Ilwal's ear in the first place, long before Do-hyuk or Hanwool ever became the visible faces of the betrayal. Someone still out there in this city, still watching, still unaccounted for. He asked me once, not long after, if there was anything left between us that wasn't settled. I looked at him, this man who burned an empire down to buy me back, who now waits for my answer instead of simply taking one, and I told him the only true thing I had left to give. He didn't press me on it, which I think surprised me more than any of the violence ever had. The old Woo-jin, the one from that first night in the garage, the one who moved parking passes and read my tea order like scripture without ever once asking permission, would have found the answer himself within the hour. This new version of him, the one who stood in front of his own elders and let me speak my vow instead of simply receiving his, just nodded once and let the silence between us stay exactly as unfinished as I needed it to be. I think that's the part of this whole story that still surprises me the most. Not the rescue, not the war, not even the boardroom. It's the fact that a man capable of burning an empire to the ground for me is also capable of waiting, patiently, for as long as it takes me to be ready to tell him the rest. Not yet. Because somewhere in Seoul, someone else is still keeping score, and this time, I'm the one who gets to decide when the ledger opens again. Sometimes, late at night, when the penthouse is quiet and the rain is doing that thing it does against the glass, I think back to the woman who stepped off that plane 3 years ago with 2 suitcases and a habit of making herself invisible. I think about how many rooms tried to tell her she was too much, or not enough, or simply not the right shape for the story they thought they were living in. I don't think she would recognize the woman sitting here now, signing her name across the top of a syndicate's hidden accounts, deciding whose debts live and whose die, loved loudly and in public by a man who once thought protecting her and protecting his empire were 2 separate math problems, and learned, the hard way, that they were always the same equation. I still have the page 47, folded small, tucked somewhere he will never think to look, because he has learned by now that some ledgers I keep only for myself. I don't know yet what I'll do with that name. Some nights I think I'll burn it the way I burned the rest, and let the past stay buried under everything we rebuilt. Other nights I think about the woman I used to be, the one who apologized for existing, and I know she would want me to open it eventually, to finish the accounting all the way to the last decimal. For now, I let the city keep its secret, and I keep mine. I sit at the head of a table I was never supposed to be allowed near, in a country that once made me feel like a rounding error, and I am, finally, unmistakably, the whole number. Whatever comes next, whoever is still out there pulling strings from the dark, I am not walking into it as collateral this time. I am walking in as the one holding the pen,